So we're now in week 9, Austrian and neoliberal political economy. We'll be talking about neoliberal political economy today through the lens of the Austrian school, with a particular focus on Hayek. Hayek, you've been asked this week to read a text by Hayek, and also two chapters from his book, The Road to Serfdom, as well as a more general introduction to the trends and features of neoliberal political economy in the Austrian school. So as we do each week, what we'll try and do is define the problem to which the neoliberals, the Austrian neoliberals, were responding. We'll look at the elements of the response, and then we'll briefly consider who gains, who loses, and doesn't matter, applying Stilwell's questions to theory itself. Now, we're coming off the back of a consideration of Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics, and we'll see that the Austrians are writing in a period, the early Austrians, Hayek and others, are writing in a period that's similar to Keynes's. But they will be wanting to suggest that Keynesianism, with its openness to the role of trade unions in boosting the income and wages of workers, as well as the role ascribed to government in boosting aggregate demand. These are, for the neoliberals, warning signs of a potential for moving to collectivist approaches to the economy, socialist or fascist. And they reject those views and see Keynesianism as a step towards increasing collectivist approaches to the economy, which are detrimental. So let's turn to the problem. That was just to try and explain where Austrian neoliberalism sits in relation to the theories that you've just been looking at. So the problem, I've chosen two photos today to support the presentation of the lecture. On one side, you've got the pamphlet for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, presented in drafted and completed in 1948. And on the other side, you've got reference to the Montpelerin Society. The Montpelerin Society, we'll see, was founded by Hayek himself in 1947 to provide a different basis for human rights and contest the manner in which human rights was being elaborated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where there was a real effort in the process of the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to include representatives from post-colonial nations who were advocating in favour of greater economic self-determination as a right for a post-colonial nation. And we'll see too that Hayek and the Montpelerin neoliberals view this idea of post-colonial economic rights to self-determination of nation states as also undermining the trade liberalisation of an international order. And we'll discuss that in a moment. But that's the rationale, that's the reason why I've chosen those photos for you today. So the background problem, there are three concerns in my view. I've tried to abstract these concerns from my own reading, drawing on Jessica Whyte's The Morals of the Markets, where she looks at a different version of human rights in the neoliberal tradition, and also from the broader texts on Austrian economics. So the first concern is a desire to oppose both socialist and conservative forces in an increasingly totalitarian Austria. Hayek was born in 1899 and he grew up in Vienna. And I think we can see in the text that you've been asked to read for today, the first two chapters of The Road to Serfdom, which is Hayek's classic text. I think we can see in that reading that Hayek was suspicious of collectivist approaches to the economy. And this was a significant period of time in Austria's history. After the First World War, Austria had previously been the Republic of German Austria, and after the war, the Republic of Austria was created when the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed in 1919. And this then terminated the state of the Republic of German Austria and left Austria on its own. It was an interesting period of time in the sense that Vienna itself remained governed by a social democrat party throughout the period between 1919 and, or more or less between 1919 and 1934, when a dictatorship came into power. But outside of Vienna, in the hinterland, in the countryside, there was rather a rule by conservative and Christian parties. So there was, broadly speaking, in the country, there was a rule only for 1 year by a social democratic party, and who brought in progressive labour and other economic reforms. And then after that, they were defeated and remained in opposition until 1934. During that period, there was a coalition of the Conservative Christian Party and a right-wing Greater German People's Party expressing discontent at the separation of the Republic of Austria from the Republic of German Austria. And but during this time, Vienna was still very much social democrat and has been called Red Vienna because of that. I mentioned to you in other lectures that during a period in which, in the 1920s in America, suburban development was taking place in that interwar period, suburban planning was along the lines of a fully detached house with its own internal kitchen and laundry, requiring domestic labour to maintain it, and thereby consolidating the traditional family in the market, in the labour market, with a division of household market labour along gendered lines in North America. In Red Vienna, things were quite different in this interwar period. Led by the Social Democrat Party, we see a massive investment in this interwar period in cooperative housing, no kitchens, apartments for families to live in with shared kitchen and laundry facilities, and much more progressive reforms around transport, infrastructure, and so forth. very much oriented to a kind of socialist agenda. So even in terms of architecture, it was very different. Now, in 1934, however, we saw the dictatorship of Engelbert Dollfuss come about, and the establishment of the Austro-fascist federal state of Austria, resolving, if you like, through coercion, escalating violence between left and right. So this is the context in which Hayek is writing. He's seen war, he's seen National Socialism, fascism, he's seen socialism, social democracy, he's seen fascism return and dictatorship, and he's wanting to oppose these because he believes that they stymie economic freedom. The second concern was a desire to oppose how human rights were being conceptualized by the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was happening in 1948. And the UDHR was formulating its conception of human rights in a manner that gave voice to post-colonial nations, so seeking to articulate a demand for a post-colonial economic right to self-determination, as I mentioned previously. So what was it that the neoliberals feared? Well, it was the nationalisation of private companies. They feared that giving post-colonial nations an economic right to self-determination in this way would permit a takeover of private companies that had already invested in these countries, and this would prevent the conditions for global trade, international trade, to the detriment of gross national product, both for countries and across the world overall, as a total. Recalling Adam Smith, when barriers to trade are removed, one can increase the annual product of a nation much more, because one then relies on comparative advantage, the comparative advantage in nations in producing those things that they're particularly good at relative to others. And this is what's going to stop if emerging post-colonial nations are permitted to nationalise private companies. So, to provide a concrete example of the sort of thing that they feared would happen, the nationalisation of the Suez Canal in 1956. Ludwig von Mises is also an Austrian economist, and he explicitly opposes this move, rejecting it as bad for international trade. On the other hand, Egyptian leaders during this time were promoting the nationalisation of the Suez Canal as in the interests of Egypt and the nation, also in terms of requiring compensation for very low wages that private companies had paid Egyptian workers over many years. A kind of wage theft claim. So the privatisation of the company that had the privatisation of the Suez Canal in 1956 didn't obviously pay the company responsible for that development the full worth of that development, because a claim was made that compensation needed to be paid for the stealing of resources from Egypt under colonised conditions, and the wage theft and so forth. Jessica Whyte outlines this this period nicely in her book too. And the neoliberals wanted to oppose this move. Have a look at Jessica Whyte's book for a nice account of this fear and this alternative concept of neoliberal human rights that Hayek and the other Montpelerin liberals were proposing. Okay, so if the first concern was really specific to Austria and to the rise of socialism, fascism, totalitarianism, dictatorships, and so forth, the second concern was about how human rights were being conceptualised by the drafters of the UDHR. And a third so we have here, that's why I chose these pictures at the start, as I mentioned. You've got Universal Declaration of Human Rights on one side, and you've got the Montpelerin Society contesting these human rights and proposing their own morals for the market, if you like. A third concern also exists during this time, and that's a desire to oppose Keynesian approaches to the economy. Hayek felt in his debate with Keynes that, it's not one that you read here, but that in your text, Hayek felt that Keynes's proposals opened the door too much to collectivism and could therefore pave the way to socialism and totalitarian fascism. So Hayek's problem, and the problem of the neoliberals, becomes, well, what processes are involved in the coordination of economic behaviour? Let's understand this. Let's see how economic behaviour might be better coordinated. And if it's the case that central planning undermines the spontaneous order that we can expect if economic behaviour is left to coordinate itself, then it would be better not to have central planning, not to have a socialist economy, not to have a fascist national economies, and not to have Keynesian interventions to boost aggregate demand. I read that Hayek was very much defending ideas that were not popular in his time. And if you remember back to Kaleski's text that you read last week, he points out that in 1943 there was very much a consensus around Keynesian economics. And Hayek's actually writing The Road to Serfdom at this time. So his work is very controversial, even if he's getting a hearing at the London School of Economics and being invited by Lionel Robbins to be a visiting lecturer there. And even if he's found a foothold in the Vienna School of logical positivism, where philosophers and the Vienna Circle, where philosophers are elaborating logical positivist views which view ethical value judgments inherent, they think, in socialism and in fascist accounts of the distribution of resources. There's an effort to get rid of these ethical value judgments, and Hayek finds an ear, a friendly ear in these circles too. Be that as it may, his work is controversial for its period. So what was the response of the neoliberals to these three concerns? Well, one response was to create a society, an intellectual society, to try to oppose these popular trends towards collectivism. So if Kaleski is showing in 1943 that really there's a more or less a consensus about Keynes, most economists share the view, we are all Keynesians now. Hayek's response is to try to find us intellectual society or create one to oppose this move. So he created the Montpelerin Society in 1947, and it was named after the Swiss resort where it was convened. 39 scholars were present at the first meeting, and these were mostly economists, but there were also several historians and philosophers like Karl Popper. They'd all been invited by Hayek, and the goal was to discuss ways in which one could resist interventionism. It was elitist and it was by invitation only. And it was dedicated to expanding economic freedom and opposing intervention. Although we'll see in a moment that it wasn't opposing all sorts of intervention. If we follow Jessica Whyte here, we'll see that neoliberals are not like laissez-faire 19th century classical thinkers who are opposed to all intervention that is not consistent with the negative liberty of economic agents. That's not the case for neoliberals. The notion of a free market is quite different to the notion of a laissez-faire market. And we'll discuss that in a moment. Interestingly, the Montpelerin Society was also funded by capitalist philanthropists. That's no surprise, Rockefeller and the likes. And it's also spawned think tanks. So in Australia, the Institute for Public Affairs and the Lowy Institute have links to the Montpelerin Society. There were 3 stages of attack. There was a long-term view on focusing on academic outputs in the area of economic theory, a short-term approach, think tank policy contributions to influence government immediately, and street fighting, supporting right-wing politicians who would be most likely to support their input into economic freedom and defence of economic freedom. Perhaps as part of this street fighting, we later see, so the Montpelerin Society lasts for several decades, and in later periods we see active involvement in right-wing revolutions in Chile, for example, the support of the Pinochet regime and the economic shock treatment reforms in opposition to the Allende government. Jessica Whyte again provides a pretty much brilliant expose of the involvement of the Chicago boys in Pinochet's economic reforms. And there's also a nice textbook, a nice book at the library, unfortunately unavailable. I'll see if I can find it in another way. On Pinochet's economists. For those of so that's one response, to create a society, the Montpelerin Society, to oppose the popular trends towards collectivism. There was also a theoretical response, and this is a depiction. This is an account of the suppositions, if you like, that will base the neoliberal approach to the market and to its analysis. So an axiomatic starting point is that people act purposively. Economics is about choices, the logic of choice. But it's not just the methodological individualism, as per point 1. It's also about subjectivism, subjective individualism. How do human actors actually perceive the world? This is a view that, again, that ethics is something that inheres in that is subjective, merely subjective. The boo hooray of ethical judgments in somebody like Ayer's logical positivism, where if you think that charity is a good thing, it's equivalent not to an objective statement that can be assessed in terms of its truth or falsity, but rather an emotional response to charity as being something good. Hooray for charity, which can't be assessed in terms of truth or falsity, but is merely emotive and subjective. So how do we access how human actors perceive the world is a question for them. Choices are plagued by uncertainty and ignorance. This is a difference then between the neoliberals and the neoclassical approach, which thinks that we can assume that individuals are rational agents and model those choices in terms of utility functions and their optimization. No, for neoliberals, choices are actually plagued by uncertainty and ignorance. So there'll be much more scope here for a social sciences approach rather than a deductive approach. Markets are a process of communication too. This addresses the lack of knowledge. So markets are not going to be places where prices, where we see price equilibrium. Rather, we see price as a means for communicating information. There's also an idea of spontaneity in neoliberal economics. Market imperfections are not market failures, but actually profit opportunities. And I think we read an earlier text by Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, which made the point that in the week on neoclassical economics, was it Schumpeter? I can't remember now. I had to have a look. That market imperfections can actually be what permits people to move in and out of less and more profitable opportunities in order to boost their profit. And if markets were perfect and adjusted immediately to supply demand, then there would no longer exist those profit opportunities. So Hayek is similar to Schumpeter in that regard. And there's also a view that efforts to improve the world usually have negative consequences. The unforeseen and unintended effects of human behaviour is something that neoliberals will be interested in. So humanitarian intervention tends to fail. Note how this is not the same as 19th century neoclassical economics like that of Marshall or the French spiritualists, or Jevons also in Britain, or Pareto and Walras in the Lausanne school of marginal utility economics. So the 19th century is being described as laissez-faire. You might recall we did that in our lectures on neoclassical economics. No market intervention is permitted except that which is compatible with the reciprocal protection of freedom from coercion. Jevons is particularly committed to the laissez-faire approach. Hayek and later Milton and Rose Friedman were explicitly critical of laissez-faire 19th century liberalism. For them, laissez-faire 19th century liberalism confined the role of the state to maintaining order and the enforcements of contracts. But for them, that's not enough. will want to see much more intervention on the part of the neoliberals. As Jessica Whyte explains, neoliberalism was a reaction to this basic error in laissez-faire 19th century liberalism. It's not enough to merely maintain order and enforce contracts. What we also need is to boost competition through intervention. So we might be substituting the goal of the competitive order for the 19th century goal of laissez-faire. And this entailed much more scope for state intervention to create those conditions for competition that 19th century laissez-faire had countenanced. So the central difference is that for neoliberals like Hayek and Friedman, there's no kind of freedom or liberty other than that which the market economy brings about. Interestingly, Hayek credits Marx as the first to recognise that private capitalism had as its precondition that the evolution of private capitalism was the precondition for the evolution of democratic freedoms. So freedom is an idea that belongs to the superstructure that we affirm because it plays a role in what's important to us, the capitalist ownership of the means of production, rather than a public ownership of the means of production. And freedom and private property allows us to make sense of that and justify it. So it's an idea that belongs to the superstructure that justifies the material conditions of our lives. But Hayek actually thinks this is a good thing. Marx thinks it's a bad thing. Hayek thinks it's a good thing. And it reflects the neoliberal idea that there's actually no kind of freedom or liberty other than that which a market economy can bring about. So if we don't have a market economy, if we don't have a free market, then for the neoliberals, we actually don't have freedom. It's a criticism, if you like, too, of the natural rights tradition of liberty. John Locke and others in the history of modern political thought have been credited for a kind of natural rights approach to liberty. But the neoliberals think that there is no thing as natural rights to freedom. There's only freedom that's conditional on the existence of a well-functioning market. I've provided you with a little video to watch for 5 minutes, so have a break, access that video, and just come back refreshed, because it's a nice little interlude. And if any, so as for the main ideas, then theoretical ideas of Hayek's neoliberalism, one idea is spontaneity. The fundamental principle is that in the ordering of our affairs, we should make as much use as possible of the spontaneous forces of society and resort as little as possible to coercion. A view that's capable of an infinite variety of applications. Related to this is the idea of spontaneous order. So individuals pursue their interests. So far as human actions are concerned, the things are what people acting think they are. This is the subjectivism of neoliberalism. So markets are spontaneous means of communicating information, and information is embedded in the price system. Remember Milton and Rose Friedman's view of price from early on in the unit as transmitting information, as providing incentives, and as being the means that we have to accept for distributing and allocating resources. Those were the three roles that Price played for Rose and Milton Friedman. Now, Rose and Milton Friedman would have had conversations about this with Hayek, who moved from Austria to the London School of Economics and then on to Chicago, where he finished off his career before retiring there in 1962. And he worked as a colleague of Milton Friedman for a period of, I think, around 10 years from memory, but I'd have to double check. And so I'm sure that Hayek's ideas would have been informing Milton and Rose Friedman's as well, in this idea of information being embedded in the price system. You can see that some of these ideas are quite compatible with neoclassical economics and compatible with the idea of price equilibrium, but not necessarily. The price mechanism is no longer primarily an equilibrating function, but for Hayek, it's the means for communicating and coordinating knowledge in a state of uncertainty. We're fundamentally uncertain and ignorant about our opportunities, and price transmits that information to us and provides us with an incentive to act. Price helps the entrepreneur overcome their ignorance. The overarching thing then is the conditions for effective social coordination. And for that, we really need a decentralized decision making. We can't have a central planner. We can't have a totalitarian fascist regime, because this undermines the ability of price to transmit information and to provide incentives. For Hayek, it's really not about the price equilibrium that then occurs between supply and demand in clearing a market. That's the neoclassical accommodation of neoliberal ideas. Rather, it's about this coordination and communication function. The order brought about by the mutual adjustment of many individual economies in the market, the kind of spontaneous order produced by the market through people acting within the rules of the law of property, tort and contract. So this means that the role of the economist is a bit different. The economist is a social scientist, and the objective here is not to understand the relation between things, but rather the relations between people and things, or the relation between people and people. So people are always at the heart of this. The aim is to explain the unintended or undesigned results of the action of many people, and I put men there because men was in the text, but I should have put people in paraphrasing. A lot of debate about what Hayek really meant, because his work spans 50 years with many inconsistencies now. Also, suspicious of abstract categories. For Hayek, collective entities like society or the economic system or capitalism are no more than provisional theories or popular abstractions, and they can't really be treated as facts, as is mistakenly thought by the scientific method. So Hayek and the neoliberals are really rather interested in trying to see how people coordinate their behaviour to overcome their ignorance. So we can now turn to the final part, part 3. Who wins, who loses, doesn't matter. Now, the question who wins, a brief analysis of how the Chicago boys trained under Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and Hayek and others at the Chicago School returned to Chile and worked under the Pinochet regime. And what we see here is a very clear indication of how neoliberal economics is concerned with economic freedom but not political freedom. So, and it's also of the view that freedom, in as much as it's conditional on the existence of a well-functioning market, doesn't think that abrogating or contravening political freedoms is a problem unless it doesn't think that that contravening political freedoms is a problem if doing that is necessary to establish a well-functioning market. And this means that the people who lose, if you like, are those who have the most to lose from not having those political freedoms. We'll see in the case of Chile that it was also those who were the least advantaged who suffered the most from the loss of Allende's support packages, if you like. And we'll also see that there's no compensation for historical injustice, which would be a breach of the private economic rights of an entrepreneur. So let me turn to those slides. So, as I explained in that lecture, there were 4 roles, and you've read that text too, for Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman, defending 4 roles for government, namely to ensure defence, to ensure economic freedom through contract law and the administration of justice, to invest in those public goods that are necessary for markets to function well, like roads that private investors might be unwilling to invest in. And there's a 4th one which I won't touch on because that is more specific to Milton and Rose Friedman. So the aim of those roles for the state is to guarantee economic freedom, but not necessarily political freedom. Political freedoms include the freedom of thought and expression, the freedom of association, the freedom to stand for public office, the freedom to vote, and so forth. And they might also include economic freedom to self-determination, including, for example, the right to collectively determine one's shared economic direction. Those sorts of economic rights to self-determination that the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had wanted to appear. But these political freedoms, as we saw, were viewed as endangering economic freedom for the neoliberals. In the case of Chile, what did political freedom appear to be jeopardized? Why did political freedom appear to be jeopardizing economic freedom? Well, Salvador Allende's socialist government had sought to nationalise the financial and productive sectors, expropriate large swathes of rural property, and replace the market with price controls. Now, these are all interventions that compromise the ability of price to transmit information, to provide incentives, and also to distribute the rewards, as Milton and Rose Friedman have argued is necessary if one accepts the first 2. And so on. This was an effort to allow Chile as a nation state, a post-colonial nation state, to determine its own way forward through economic policies that were not yet submissive to the idea of a free market. So the implications of seeking to guarantee economic, not political freedom by mainstream economists are the following in Chile. It was deemed acceptable, and Milton Friedman and Hayek are quite clear on this in their correspondence and writings about this, about Pinochet. It was deemed acceptable for Pinochet to pursue strategies designed to ensure economic freedom, even if these were inconsistent with the political freedoms that we hold dear to ourselves in liberal democracies. So with a military coup is undermining the popular majority voting strategy of liberal democracies to express popular sovereignty through voting. We also saw the suspension of democratic rule and its associated political freedoms. There was no political freedom to think and express oneself, or to freedom to associate with others. There was no freedom to stand for public office. There was no political freedoms like this. I remember when I studied in France in the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, I had a friend who was Chilean, and I spoke to her about Pinochet a couple of times, and every time I spoke to her, she involuntarily looked over her shoulder, like, who else is listening to this conversation? What can I say? So those are the sorts of political freedoms that at a very everyday life level one no longer has. Political freedom to thought and expression. So we saw political repression to get rid of dissidents, a brutal program of torture, assassination and extrajudicial killing of leftists, social democrats and trade unionists. The imposition of economic policies, even if they undermine the poor. In other words, it was legitimate to use political repression to shatter what one neoliberal economists refer to as the romanticism that's a barrier to economic freedom, and you will have seen that in your text. So the idea is that economic freedom is really conditional upon the existence of a well-functioning market, and that really political freedom is only something that one can expect to occur or to have only after a well-functioning market has existed to permit one to have economic freedom first. So economic freedom is fundamental, and only once that is guaranteed can political freedoms follow, is the idea. So how did the policies of these two approaches, political freedom versus economic freedom, compare? So we had political freedom, the socialist government of Allende on the left-hand side, and the economic freedom emphasised by Pinochet's military junta and the Chicago Boys. So for Allende's socialist regime, we have the idea that all children must begin life equally with equal medical care, education and nutrition. We had the attempt to seek the amelioration of existing inequalities by displacing the market as the key allocator of basic commodities. Price was not going to be the key means to allocate goods and services, as we've seen, as we know is important for the mainstream economists. We saw instead the political freedom. We saw instead the Allende government lay stake to a political right to economic self-determination of this post-colonial society,
the nationalisation of Chile's largest US-owned copper mines with a refusal to pay compensation on account for deducting for historical injustice. We saw this as explicitly depicted as a challenge to global inequalities that had resulted from colonisation. And we also saw expanded spending, public spending on social services, health, education and housing, distribution of free powdered milk to young children, heavily subsidised public transport, mandated pay rises, price controls, popular resorts for socialised leisure even. So we saw that the revolutionary purpose was to consolidate ideals of solidarity and generosity, the fight for justice and equality. Now, it's not that the mainstream economists like Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys were amoral. Indeed, there's a very strong commitment here to upholding rationality and individual liberty. Economic freedom becomes a moral objective to which other objectives need to submit. What's important is equal opportunities, but only equal opportunities to compete in a free market, and not equal opportunities that require the restructuring of society to undo social class differences or disabilities in natural talent and so forth. All we have is a commitment to equal opportunities to compete in a free market and the moral objective of upholding rationality and individual liberty. It's a very minimal morality, if you like. And the effect was that they rejected the idea of granting rights of economic self-determination to post-colonial nations, since they felt this compromised trade, global trade. It would prevent investors from having the security of knowing that they could invest in other countries, like the US copper mines. Who would invest if subject to the threat of nationalisation with no compensation? They also supported a military government, and a particularly brutal one, because they felt that this was far better than the economic disarray that was to be expected under the Allende regime, Allende government. So this was to induce Chileans to submit to the market, with political freedom to come later. So it was accepted by Pinochet and the Chicago boys that this was only a temporary economic shock that was required to train Chileans to submit to the market, so that then they could later have the political freedoms that would follow, even if it had a big impact upon the poor at the time, and even if it led to the political shock of the junta's torture chambers. So trade liberalisation and tariff reductions we saw, the widespread privatisation of a whole range of services previously provided by government, including social security, a regressive goods and services tax applied uniformly. So a progressive tax will primarily the burden of a progressive tax will primarily fall on the rich and the wealthy. A regressive goods and services tax is one that's applied uniformly, which actually has a heavier burden on lower income earners. So we saw mainstream economists providing a tax applied uniformly, taking a larger percentage of income from low income earners than from high income earners. What Friedman referred to as shock treatment, a drastic reduction in public spending, which was viewed to be necessary even though it increased unemployment. And as Naomi Klein has pointed out, this led to a massive transfer of wealth to the wealthiest individuals and to monopolies. And her claim is that this required the political shock of the torture chambers to get rid of the dissidents. And so we see quite a different revolutionary purpose, if you like, to, on one hand, to consolidate ideals of solidarity and generosity in the fight for justice and equality, as opposed to the minimalist morality of the mainstream economists and the Chicago boys who were informing the Pinochet regime and advising them to uphold rationality and individual liberty, along with equal opportunities to compete in a free market, with the goal being economic freedom and not political freedom, with political freedom hoped to come later. A further difference, price controls, Allende versus price stability, Pinochet and the Chicago boys. So whereas Allende sought to ensure access for poor workers to goods through price controls, Pinochet's through controlling the price, so to try to ensure that certain goods were accessible at different types of prices and to ensure that wages were rising at certain levels and so forth. Pinochet's Chicago boys instead sought price stability. So it's different objectives. Remember lecture 1? Price for the mainstream economists is what transmits information and provides incentives. We know when price increases that if we're suppliers of ice cream, then we're going to want to provide more. And we know if price decreases, then as buyers of ice cream, we're also going to want more. Now, price stability, it's ability to be affected merely by market interactions, unaffected by external price controls, is essential for economic freedom because it allows individuals and suppliers to make their decisions based on their preferences and their willingness to pay. So how is price to be stabilised according to the mainstream economists like Milton Friedman and others? This slide is really, I want people who are not in the PPE degree to still listen to this, but this is designed, these next two slides are really for the PPE students who may be looking at some of these issues in their first year economics unit. So inflation was a big issue in Chile. Inflation is when the amount of money that you need to pay, let's say for a trolley full of groceries, increases over time. Inflation in Chile in the second year of Allende's term rose significantly. So that meant that if you went to the supermarket in 1 week's time, you would be required to pay more for the same groceries than the price that you paid this week. So more money would be needed for you to pay for that. So Allende had also tried to compel through legislation employers to pay workers higher wages due to this phenomenon. So the idea is that people need price stability in order to have the economic freedom to choose in the market. But how can inflation be reduced according to the mainstream economists that informed Pinochet's regime? Well, you can increase interest rates. That's what we've seen in times of high inflation in Australia. This reduces the demand for loans. It reduces the ability of producers and developers to invest. And when you have less people taking out loans and less investment because people don't want to take on additional debt, then this also reduces the amount of workers that are employed. It also decreases wages because unemployment will increase demand for jobs, making workers willing to accept lower wages to get back into work. And this, in general, then leads to a drop in consumer demand in how many people are wanting to buy products in markets admires, for example, and how much they're willing to spend. And this reduces the amount then of money that one needs to pay for a shopping trolley of groceries. It reduces inflation. So that's one way that inflation can be reduced, by increasing interest rates. The second way of reducing inflation is by reducing public spending on social services. This again reduces demand and reduces inflation. How? Well, if public spending on social services is going primarily to those who are most in need of those social services, then the least well off will have more resources than they would otherwise have had, and this increases the amount of money because this is the amount of those people who are least well off. If they get extra money, it's normally spent immediately in consumption, in consuming goods on the market. So public spending on social services tends to increase demand, and this can also increase inflation because if the demand for goods is higher, the price of those goods will increase to find a market clearing price that is demand. Now, if you reduce public spending on social services, that means that people who are the least well off don't have as much money to spend, and that means that this reduces demand and reduces the price of those goods and services that are in your shopping trolley because there's less demand for them. And this reduces inflation, the amount that the amount of money that bundle of goods and services increases over time. That rate goes down. So reduced public spending also can control inflation. But notice who is most affected by these policies. As Jessica Whyte argues in The Morals of the Market, this approach is not morally neutral. Both policies hit the working class the hardest in Chile, and this was what Milton Friedman expressly referred to as the shock treatment that was supposed to be necessary to induce Chileans to submit to the market. And so we saw the burden of these changes being disproportionately suffered by the poor and the working class, with investors and creditors very happy to have these changes take place because of the disproportionate weight that the disproportionate impact that they had on the working class poor. So although it's a moral issue for mainstream economists to ensure price stability, because this is seen as essential to ensuring economic freedom, we can see that the mechanisms by which this price stability is maintained in Chile had a disproportionate effect on the working class poor. That's not to say that Allende's government too was also not great for some segments of Chilean society, and that's not to say that there wasn't a great deal of discontent with Allende's government, but it is to point out that the burden is borne by different people as an effect of the different types of policies that were being implemented. And it's also to show that these policies are not necessarily morally neutral, as mainstream economists tend to depict them. It's not just about ensuring a minimal moral commitment to economic freedom, but it actually has an impact upon the working class primarily, even if it's hoped that after this shock treatment the economy can permit working class people to eventually enjoy economic freedom as well. So this is the second slide that's really for PPE students only, but I do encourage the other students to listen to it. Jessica Whyte's further argument. This might even be of interest to students studying international relations in this unit. Her further argument is quite nuanced. It's that international human rights organisations were implicated in this as well. So Amnesty International, it's her main example. She points out how they actually gave up on trying to fight for the political right of post-colonial nations to have economic self-determination, to nationalise the copper mines, to nationalise the Suez canal, to expropriate land, and to undertake public social service provision, and so forth. International human rights organisations gave up on trying to fight for the political right of post-colonial nations to economic self-determination, which had previously been important in the drafting of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. Instead of that, from the 70s onwards, international human rights organisations tended to try to avoid participating in broader questions about self-determination of post-colonial nations or socialist governments or the nature of government. They didn't enter into debate about whether a socialist government like Allende, voted in through liberal democratic processes, should have the right to determine the economic policies of their nation state. Rather, these international human rights organisations like Amnesty International were concerned with a different question. They weren't concerned with whether the military overthrow was legitimate or even with who it was that was targeted, leftists, trade unionists, socialists. Instead, they were concerned with insisting that whatever economic system was in place, whatever government was in place, international human rights organisations came to limit their role to insisting that that government in question uphold basic human rights. So in this case, in the case of Chile, insisting that the Pinochet regime uphold basic human rights. And so Jessica Whyte makes a really interesting point that in a context in which the junta was, the military regime was using political repression to torture and murder dissidents across Chile, leftists, socialists, supporters of Allende, in order to rid the country of internal dissent. At the very same time as the military junta was doing this, they were also welcoming international human rights organisations like Amnesty International into their borders to assess what was happening. And these international human rights organisations were not subject to this sort of treatment at all. There was a commitment to human rights of a different sort, the idea that human rights is something that can only be expected to exist and flourish once a well-functioning market has come into existence. And so we see that Jessica Whyte makes a claim that international human rights discourse during this period shifted in a way to support the ideological framework of neoliberal mainstream economists, because it required only that society stop torturing and murdering dissidents, and it didn't argue at all for any rights to economic self-determination on the part of post-colonial nations, which would have involved a very different array of concerns and policies. Okay.
So that was my attempt to try to explain why it matters, who wins, who loses, and why it matters. Here are a couple of references for you as well to support the reading for today, and thank you for staying with me till now.